Here we go. Hey,
Okay.
this is Mike. Today is January 2nd, and I'm interviewing my friend Russ Eckel, who is someone from this I met social economy, social policy program at Boston College. Hey, Russ.
Michael, how are you?
Doing all right. So
Good.
let's start off, Russ. Tell me a bit about your childhood and kind of what led you to be part of, the program at Boston College.
Well, so I'll cover a little bit about my kind of youth, um, and uh, and then I'll maybe in the course of the conversation we might even find some connections between that and social economy. But yeah, I grew up in a town just west of Boston, Arlington, Massachusetts. Um, it was a very nice, it was a wonderful town to grow up in. It bordered Cambridge and Somerville. It was a kind of a working class and middle class community. I was not, I was a good student. I was not an exceptional student. I mean, I don't think anybody, you know, would necessarily have assumed that I would go on and, to graduate school and get my doctorate. But I liked school. I think I was always curious. Wasn't the greatest in science. I mean, it was very clear I was not going to be a physicist or an oncologist. I had a very strong interest in politics and such. And in fact, when I went off to college, my major in college was international relations, and I was very interested in that. I enjoyed languages quite a bit, um, but like so many of us, who the baby boomer generation, who kind of came of age in the '60s, you were very aware of the world around you in that sense. So the idea of, when I was in high school, I think in my mind, I might have thought of myself as like working in the State Department or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
We're
and of course, the other thing is growing up in Boston,
Yeah.
um, my parents were not, you know, ideologues, but they were strong Democrats. My dad grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and his dad was a big Roosevelt guy during the Depression. So, and likewise, my mother, and both my parents lost both their parents, except for my one grandmother, when they were both pretty young. So, the legacy, the psychological legacy, the political legacy of the Great Depression and World War II were absolutely took center stage in terms of my own parents' biographies, and so we were a strong Democratic family, and of course, growing up in Boston, 1959, 1960, 61, everybody was in love with John Kennedy. So we kind of, that whole kind of Kennedy mystique, we were imbued with that. Um, and so I carried that from through high school. I was pretty active in high school and in a lot of different things. But um, then I go off to a college where I could major in international relations. And it turns out this was not why I went there, but it was again a Catholic college in Worcester, Massachusetts. And and at that point, clearly, I'm the kind of the unraveling, both the intellectual and even the kind of emotional, psychological unraveling that so many people went through in the mid and late '60s into the early '70s. That you wake up one morning and clearly between the war in Vietnam and so many of the other conflicts in the United States beginning in the early 1960s. Um, it was we all went through some period of disillusionment followed by activism. And so when I'm in college, um, it didn't take too long before the idea of going to work for the State Department completely dissolves.
Right.
Nothing particularly came to replace it. And because I was too busy going to the anti-war demonstrations and all of that sort of thing. And I
Now
was
you
very
weren't,
active.
so you weren't drafted then.
No, and I'll tell you about this in a little bit, but
Okay.
one, my eyesight,
Okay.
even back then was not very good. But number two, I was in the first lottery and my draft number was like 330, something like that. So it was very clear that I think that was 1970 was the first lottery. So, you know, basically what everyone was saying back then is, there's no way you're gonna, get drafted.
Yeah.
So no, I managed to avoid that, and obviously, millions of other people, unfortunately, were
Yeah.
not able to avoid it.
Right.
So,
But you're in,
and so,
it's after college now. And so, I mean, what year is that then?
well, so I should have graduated by the calendar and the clock
Right.
in 1972. I graduated in 73.
Okay.
Took a year off, what would have been my senior year, and worked basically. And nothing spectacular. I went to work for a furniture company that was also a building supply company, and it was in upstate New York. And I was a driver's helper on a truck. And it was, there was nothing to write home about as far as the job goes, but it was a wonderful social experience for me because um, I was instrumental in bringing together a group of the people who worked. And this was not a big company. We're talking about maybe 50, 60, 70 people in total. But we organized a union.
Oh.
And I was on one of the trucks one day with this fellow who he was just absolutely just this most wonderful, wonderful person. His name was Clovis Carey from Ballston Spa, New York. Clovis and I got along famously. And one day we're driving, we're delivering, and we stopped for coffee. And at one point I just said to Clovis, "Hey Clovis, you've worked for this company for quite a while. Has anybody ever tried to organize a union here?" And Clovis kind of said, "Well, back in the 50s, some people tried that, but it didn't work out so well." And I said, "Well, what do you think?" So we started talking about it. Long story short, a couple of months later, in the dead of winter, we had called the Teamsters Union, the Teamsters out of Albany, New York, if you can imagine. And we're at Clovis's house. There's probably about 15 people who've come together. The two representatives from the Teamsters Union in Albany drive up to Ballston Spa, New York. It's pouring rain. It's probably, January or February. Clovis lives on a house set way back off the road. He has this long driveway that's full of mud. And these two guys get out of there, each came in their own cars respectively, and they were both dressed in sharkskin suits. No lie. Right? They're in sharkskin suits. One's driving a Caddy, the other one I think had a Lincoln. But they came in. We were hysterical watching these two guys walk up to Clovis's front door. But again, we heard all about what we needed to do, and sure enough, we went through the whole process, and everyone loved Clovis, and they trusted him. We had to be very careful early on.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of getting this kind of, you know, uh, not indoctrination, but I'm learning a lot about, you know, how you actually form a union in a company, learning about the National Labor Relations Board and all this kind of stuff. So we did in fact get the majority of the people at the company to sign the NLRB cards, petitioning the company for an election, and we won the election. And just before I left to go back to school, we helped organize or negotiate the first contract. So that was fun.
But why, Russ? But why did you do this? I mean, you're this young kid, right? I assume the people you're working with are a bit older than you.
They were all, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I mean,
I mean,
why?
you know, it's a good, there was something, there were a few things that happened, nothing egregious. You know,
Yeah.
by today's standards, these would have been thought of as trivial incidents in a workplace,
Yeah.
almost like why even pay attention?
Yeah.
But I just, you know, I felt the the and again, these none of us were poorly treated. I mean, this is not a sweatshop. This is just a nice, it's a family owned, family run business,
Huh.
that type of thing. But I just, it felt to me that the people who work there, and you know, this is my first real full-time job, that the people who work there were not treated with the respect that I thought they deserved.
Hmm.
So it part of it was economic, and part of it was just, wait a minute, you know, even in this little company of, you know, 50, 60 employees, there's a there's a power imbalance here. And I can see almost on a day-to-day basis what that, how that plays out, kind of, you know, phenomenologically, how that plays out in the workplace every day. And I was offended by it at some level. And and I had been in one union previously, which is another part of my immediate post-college experience. I did, in fact, during college, have one of the most wonderful jobs that you could imagine. I worked for the Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Woods Hole Steamship Authority
Wow.
out of Woods Hole. So all summer long, for 3 summers, I'm on a steamship. In fact, I worked on one of the last actually functioning steamship ferries that went from Woods Hole to Nantucket, the SS Nobska, all summer long, 1969, 1970, 1971. But to work for the Steamship Authority, you had to both be in the National Maritime Union, the NMU, which I joined, and you had to have your Siemens papers. You had to actually have your merchant Siemens documents. So I got both of those because, you know, everybody had to get them. So I had a little bit of, I'd had a little bit of experience with unions, albeit as a summer seasonal employee.
Yeah.
At the Woods Hole Steamship Authority. And again, I saw that, you know, the union, in my mind, the union was both a good thing ethically and also necessary. So something, and you know, I didn't grow up in a household where there were union members. My dad was a salesperson. So, you know, I didn't grow up hearing about Walter Reuther or people like that. But there was this intuitive sense that I had that unions mattered and that unions were important, particularly in a capitalist economy. So the one time I'm now working full time, and I actually had an opportunity to kind of pose the question, we did. And we organized this little company and everybody got a decent pay raise and whatever. But to me, the most important thing was people had representation, and there were rules now and the boss could not just be the boss, period, amen, end of story. You know what I mean?
Right, right. So now
So
you
now
go,
I
go
so
ahead.
now I graduated in 1973,
Yeah, okay.
and as I said, I'm kind of, you know, in my own, my life experience is shifting, um, and you know, I'm not ready to go off to graduate school. I'm not thinking about any of that. In fact, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't really have career aspirations at all at that point. I'm like, I'm out of college. Okay, now what? Well, in my wallet, I have my National Maritime Union card, which is still up to date, and I'm still a member of the United States Merchant Marine.
Right.
I went to the local NMU hiring hall in South Boston, and lo and behold, I got a job for the summer on a gasoline tanker
Oh my gosh.
that sailed a couple of times while I was on it from Portland, Maine to Port Arthur, Texas. It wasn't the most exotic or thing in the world, but there is kind of a there's an interesting side story to this, which is also in the spring of 1973. So just before I graduate college, I was diagnosed with a pretty serious eye disease, genetic eye disease. My older sister Diane was also diagnosed with it, and because it's genetic, um, the doctor that diagnosed my sister tested everyone in our family, and it turns out I have this eye condition that's called retinitis pigmentosa.
Hmm.
And so a couple of months before I graduate college, an eye doctor says to me, you know, I don't want to be too dramatic here, so to speak, but you need to think about what you can learn to do to support yourself because you'll be blind before you're 30. So I'm like, okay. So I'm processing that, and in the meantime, I get on a gasoline tanker where I'm on. You know, you work on 4 hour rotations, right? So you're on the 8 to 12 watch, or you're on the 12 to 4 watch, or you're on the 4 to 8 watch, or the over this course of 24 hours. So I think on this gasoline tanker that I was working on, I was on the 8 to 12 watch, morning and evening. So I'm standing bow watch on a gasoline tanker. Um, Now, obviously, standing bow watch is not like what it would have been in the 19th or earlier 20th century, because all these ships obviously have radar and all kinds of other things. But the traditions of the merchant marine and the rules of the union contract said you still had to have a seaman on the bow signaling when other ships were in range, right? And this was a really old ship, and they literally had a bell, and you rang one bell to port, 2 bells to starboard. The very first night I'm on this ship, we sail through the New York City shipping lane. So, off of Manhattan, off of Brooklyn. We're in the New York City shipping lanes heading south to, I think we were heading to Wilmington, Delaware or something. So now it's midnight. I'm coming off watch. The second mate was the watch officer. And when you came off watch, one of the things you do is you go up to the bridge of the ship and you make coffee for the officers for the next shift. I walk up there, I'm, hey, how are you? Good evening, sir. How are you? Fine, fine, fine. And he just turns to me and he says, how's your eyesight? And I'm like, oh, my eyesight's fine. Why? Now, one of the conditions of RP is you basically don't have any night vision. So I've never, even as a kid, I had very, very poor night vision. I never drive at night, that type of thing. And I'm saying to the second mate on the ship, I'm saying, oh, my eyesight's fine. I'm going off and making coffee. And I said to him, sir, why do you ask? And he said, well, you missed some ships out there tonight, son. I said, oh, well, I'll do a better job. And he said, just so you know, you missed the Queen, the QE2. We sailed apparently within about 2 miles of the Queen, the largest ship on the ocean on the planet. And I didn't see it.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
So that was fun. And then, so that was a few months over the summer. And then it's late summer, 73, I think, maybe, if I have my dates right. I remember sitting in the NMU Union Hall watching the Watergate hearings.
Yeah.
And I think that was July, August 1973. And I'm watching the Watergate hearings. And a job gets posted on the board. And of course, all of this is done by seniority. But it's a Friday later in the day. There was hardly anybody in the hall. So turns out I get another job. And I'm now on a freighter. It's called the Austral Patriot, owned and operated by the Faro Lines out of Brooklyn, New York. And it sails between Brooklyn and Cape Town, South Africa.
Oh my gosh.
So long story again. So for the next almost a year, 10, 11 months, I made 2 trips on the Austral Patriot between the United States, and we stopped at every industrial city in South Africa. Our first port of call was always Cape Town. We went to Port Elizabeth, we went to East London, we went up to Mombasa in Mozambique, we went on to the west coast of Africa, Angola. So I am literally sailing the world on this freighter, having this remarkable experience. So now I come back, it's 1974, 75, I come back. I went out for just several months to California, Santa Cruz, for a while. I had some friends out there. I remember being in downtown Santa Cruz. Great place. I lived across the street from the Hotel Santa Cruz. And I worked at a leather tannery. So again, I've got another kind of industrial job. And I'm in another union. I'm in the Amalgamated Meat Cutters Union. And I wasn't there long enough to get active in the union, but I was there long enough to, again, I appreciated what the unions were about. But the other thing was I, would sometimes go into Berkeley and that type of thing. And I also learned about, and this is kind of important in terms of the story of social economy. I was introduced to food cooperatives, the Berkeley Food Co-op and some of the other food co-ops. And for some reason, I thought this was just the greatest thing since sliced bread. So I left Santa Cruz, came back to Boston, in fact, came back to Arlington. And so now it's 1975. So, I've sailed the 7 seas. I'm done with that. Still don't have any strong career aspirations in the traditional sense, and decided that I wanted to start a food co-op in my hometown of Arlington. And so one day I put an ad in the local newspaper, the Arlington Advocate, and I got a room at the town hall. And sure enough, this one night, it was in the summer, must have been the summer of 75, like 50 or 60 people showed up and said they were interested in starting a food co-op. And while I was doing my research, I met a number of the people who had been very active in the food co-op movement in New England. Turns out that New England was a hotbed of food co-ops, particularly the metro Boston area. And the heart of it, the hub of it, was the Boston Food Co-op. So I got to know a number of the people who organized the Boston Food Co-op, eventually the Cambridge Food Co-op. And there's one person in particular who became a very dear friend of mine, one of the most loving people I've ever known. His name is Bill Coghlan. Bill came out of BU, SDS. The Boston Food Co-op actually started as the Boston University Food Co-op. All these people were living in Alston, Brighton. And Bill was just this remarkable guy. And he and some other people kind of wrote the Bible in the 1970s of the food co-ops, and it was called the Food Co-op Handbook. And I had bought one of the copies of that handbook, and I got to know Bill, and then Bill and I just became very close almost immediately. In fact, Bill came out to the initial meeting in Arlington, and Bill was a character. He was as charismatic as the day is long, and he could talk, and he was just fabulous. So again, within a matter of months, we had started a store of. So I wound up being the manager, making the princely sum of $75 a week, learning how to run a food store. One of the great things about it was I had a pickup truck, an old Ford F-150 red pickup truck. So my job every day, first thing, was to go to the New England Produce Center and get the produce. And I loved that, that was a lot of fun. So we opened this food co-op. There were several hundred members. We were then a part of the New England Food Co-op organization, NEFCO. I was on the board of NEFCO for some number of years. So now it's the mid to late 70s, and I'm kind of a food co-op guy, right? Bill Coghlan and I and a few other people in the late 70s started something called the New England Co-op Network. And we got a VISTA grant, and we hired a number of people through the VISTA program to go up into like rural Maine, parts of New Hampshire, to kind of begin to start, pre-order co-ops, because the co-op movement in the 1970s in New England was really strong. And frankly, I was having a ball. I mean, I was just having a great time. I wasn't making a penny, but I was having a wonderful time. I was at that point, I had married a wonderful person, Jennifer, who, needless to say, had a real job that paid the rent. And but I learned a lot about everything from buying and preserving food to running a democratic organization, which is what the food co-ops were, and then helping to start other co-ops around New England. And then I got very active in the initiative in the late 70s to start a national consumer cooperative bank. And that's kind of my connection to social economy directly, because through that work, I heard about the social economy program at BC. Never would have known about it necessarily otherwise, but I heard about it, and I applied as a master's student. So September 1981, I had stopped working at the food co-op, because now I'm going to do this graduate work for a year or two full time, do some things on the side. And my thought at that time was I was going to continue to work more or less in the cooperative business development process. And social economy, I fell in love with Sev Bruin, Paul Bernstein, people like that. So I'm there. Now I'm there a year, 2 years. And my story, my path, my work in social economy begins to bend back to the original trajectory, which were the unions. So I'm still a member of the co-ops. I'm still active with NEFCO, but what happened was a couple of us were in the graduate student lounge one day. I think it was in the summer or early fall. And there's a notice on the bulletin board, and it's a competition. It's an academic competition sponsored by General Motors. They've selected 10 sociology departments from around the United States, and then they've invited people to prepare an essay. And the topic of the essay for all of the schools that wanted to participate in this was describe how new technology impacted industrial relations in an industry. Well, what really caught our attention was the fact that the winning team got $10,000.
Right.
Okay. I mean, the the intellectual side of it was also interesting, but what some of us took note of is, and I think the second place was like 7,500, third place out of 10 might have been 5,000. So we're like, okay, we have a shot. Now we're going up against Wisconsin, U of M, UCLA. I mean, there's some serious players here. I think Paul Gray and Charlie Derber, two professors at BC in the social economy program, they agreed to kind of, okay, so we put together a team. There are about 3 or 4 of us, I think. And the industry that we happened to pick was telecommunications. The reason for that is because this was right at the time that microwave communication was coming into its own, and the old AT&T system had been broken up by federal judge orders. So we picked the telecommunications industry, and then we looked at how the breakup of AT&T affected industrial relations, both within AT&T, but also within the entire telecommunications industry. So we did some great research. I mean, we went down, I can remember going down and talking to people at AT&T headquarters outside of New York City. We talked with a number of people at the IBEW unions, and we prepared a paper. And I think we had like 3 or 4 months to do this. And so we wrote a paper on the impact of the legal rulings breaking up AT&T, the new technology being, I think the company was MCI at the time, Microwave Communications Incorporated. So that was the new technology. Well, we submit the paper. Don't you know, we won the contest.
Unbelievable.
We did not believe it, but it was pretty exciting. We got flown out to Detroit, where there was a lunch. So I'm at the world headquarters of General Motors with the team. Paul Gray is with us, and we get our 10,000. And the dean's office and the department voted to actually split the money amongst the students. So they really did. They were wonderful about it. But what happened was this issue of work and technology and what was happening in terms of the structure of the American economy, and in particular, what was happening with unions, I got really interested in that again. So from an intellectual and an activist point of view, my interest is shifting away from cooperative workplaces and that type of thing back towards what's happening with labor unions in America. And within months of that happening, Charlie Derber came to a couple of us one day and said, would we be interested in writing a grant? And it's pretty complicated, but in so many words, the grant was to this tiny federal agency called the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, FIPSE. We called it the FIPSE grant. And it was having something to do with the economy and the shifting and globalization. How that fit in within FIPSE, I never knew, but it didn't matter. So we wrote a grant and we partnered with the Massachusetts AFL-CIO. The president at the time was a fellow by the name of Arthur Osborne, and he was a pretty good guy. And what we came to them and said is, at that time in Massachusetts, this is now 83, 84, there are a lot of major industrial workplaces in Massachusetts and industries that were really being seriously impacted by the rise of globalization. So for instance, one of them was General Motors had a plant right outside of Boston in Framingham. And what we said was, the theory behind the grant was the traditional system of labor relations in the United States was under severe stress. Unions and unionized companies were increasingly under pressure. And typically the only solutions that were being offered at the time were, the companies just inevitably go out of business, or on the left and within the labor movement, there was a strong push to essentially keep out a lot of the foreign products in particular, and some of the new technologies that were putting pressure on the traditional industrial industries like automotive and steel, for instance. Mm-hmm. And what we said was, well, maybe there's a third way. And we're going to experiment with it at the local level. And so we got a 5-year grant. It was amazing. This was 1983. We got $500,000. And we had a team of graduate students from the social economy program. A number of the grad students were in it. Paul Gray and Charlie were the faculty supervisors. And for instance, as an example, one of our projects was at the General Dynamics shipyard in Quincy. Huge employer on the South Shore, major employer in Eastern Massachusetts. There was the General Electric plant in Lynn. That was another site of ours. There were several of these industrial work sites. The idea was the grad students, we were supposed to go out and start doing research, but the underlying idea was that we would be kind of the neutrals, if you were, that would try to get the local union and local management talking about what could be done to kind of, make these operations, frankly, a bit more competitive. Okay.
Quality circles kind of thing? Or?
Yes, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So the idea was that one of the barriers to a kind of transition for traditional American manufacturing and unionized companies would be a transition to a more kind of democratic employee involvement, labor management partnership, right? Breaking down some of both the legal but the cultural barriers that existed in a lot of workplaces between managers and workers, and between union leaders and and managers. This was not a popular idea, particularly amongst the left. This idea of labor management partnerships was seen as kind of really undermining class consciousness, and could potentially really hurt the working class. Our perspective was, by the mid-1980s, the idea that you could keep companies like Toyota and Sony out of the U.S. market, our theory was at that time was that that ship had already sailed, that you weren't going to put that genie back in the bottle. We weren't going to go back to the days where it was Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, but on the other hand, um, you could also imagine a day when, you know, some of these companies would be, and all these good union jobs would be threatened. So could we begin to bring in some new ideas into the conversation? And that's what we were doing at these workplaces. Well, one of the work sites I was working on was the GM Framingham plant. Turns out that plant was notorious for its adversarial labor relations. You couldn't put the local union representatives and management in a room without checking for guns and knives. I mean, these people just could not. And General Motors at the time was talking openly about closing the plant. Meanwhile, our governor at the time, Michael Dukakis, was trying desperately to work with people in Washington and elsewhere to try to keep the plant open. And we thought that if the union and management could sit down and begin to talk about some of the issues that were quite apparent in this manufacturing plant, that would help contribute towards perhaps General Motors not shutting the place down. Okay, so at that point, it's called the Boston College AFL-CIO Worker Education Program. At the time, there was a group of us, we were all a team, grad students and faculty, but I was kind of appointed the co-director along with a full-time person from the Mass AFL-CIO. So this was a lot of work. And in the meantime, I'm still doing all my coursework. And in the meantime, Charlie Derber suggested that I reapply and get into the PhD track, which I did. So now, you know, we're doing this work. I have a few other things I'm doing. In 1984, our first son, Matthew, was born. So my life is pretty full. And my eyesight is starting to fail because that's in the back of my mind too.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Things are moving along. And the same doctor who diagnosed me back in the early 70s got money to start a clinical treatment trial for retinitis pigmentosa. So this is around the same time, and that was pretty intense. So I wound up in 3 of these clinical treatment trials over a period of about 10 years. So that's going on. But anyway, it's now the summer of 1985. So the project at GM at the Framingham plant has been going on for about a year. I'm home with my then 9-month-old son, Matthew, on a hot day in August. And I get a phone call from Charlie Derber, faculty member in the social department at BC. And Charlie says, "Russ, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, Charlie, I'm home doing a little schoolwork and taking care of Matthew." Well, he said, "I just got a phone call. There are some people from Detroit, from General Motors and the UAW, who have flown into town and they would like to meet with us."
Oh my God.
And I was like, "Well, I'd be available tomorrow, Charlie." And he was like, "Well, they're really hoping they could meet with us today." I'm like, "Okay." So I called my twin sister, Carolyn, who was at that time living in South Boston. I asked her if I could drop Matthew off at her house. Luckily, she was home that day. She said, "Sure." So I made it to campus around noontime. And there's 4 or 5 people literally in McGuinn Hall. And we went down for lunch at the faculty lounge that I think was the only place open on campus at that time in August. And they're all in these suits, and it was a brutally hot day. And they proceed to tell us this story about how they are kind of the formative first cadre of people from the union, the international union, and General Motors labor relations, who had been charged with establishing the first General Motors UAW National Training Center. It had been negotiated in the most recent national labor contract. And they said, one of the first programs we want to start is a joint labor management education program, because we think we've got to start talking about what's going on, what's happening to our industry, what's happening to our union. But we want to have people, mostly from academia or from the outside, put this program together and then run it for us. And they said, would you be willing to work on this with us? So 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm home in Salem, Massachusetts with my son, Matt, probably preparing for a day in the backyard on the swings or something. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm at the faculty lounge at Boston College, and Charlie was there, myself, one other person. I'm not sure if Paul Gray was there or not, but we said, yes, we would love to do it. And one of the fellows then took me aside and said, we're going to need somebody to coordinate this program. Would you like to do it?
Ugh.
And I said, sure. And so now now our own program is still going on. We had a 5-year grant that was, so that work is going to go on until 87, 88.
Right.
And we said, sure. So they appointed somebody from U of M, this wonderful guy, Alex Micklejohn, and he was going to work with us and another team of people. There was not just the people from Boston College. They had people from U of M, a few other schools, and we were charged with putting together a 5-week program. The target audience were local labor leaders and local managers, plus some of the international union leaders. And the idea was it would be the first of its kind labor management education program, the purpose of which was to try to bring in new ideas about how GM and the UAW could begin to seriously address the challenges of global competition. So we wound up actually having a whole week in Boston. So the program came together. The pilot was in September, I think, 1986. The program ran, so 5 weeks. It was condensed down to 4 weeks. One of those weeks was in Boston. Our job was to talk about the economy, new ideas about how the economy could change, as well as changing labor relations. So we put together a team. We had to put together a 40-hour week program. There were some fabulous people. This fellow, Charles Heckscher, at the time was at Harvard Business School. Charles was doing some amazing work. Tom Koken was over at MIT. He and another fellow, Bob McCursey, they turned out to be great guys. They had just written a new book called The New Industrial Relations. And they were also kind of, from an IR point of view, they were really pushing the labor unions and trade groups to think more about the importance of labor management cooperation. We were talking flat out about economic democracy, workplace democracy. The solution to globalization was workplace democracy. So that was the Boston College perspective. So it was that kind of, Sev Bruin social economy perspective. And it turned out it was a very successful program. I had a contract with the UAW General Motors National Training Center for pretty much the next 20 plus years, because we eventually ran the program for them. A couple of years later, so this would have been 1987 maybe,
yeah.
These same folks from the UAW GM National Training Center come back to us and said, we love the program. We're getting the leadership, the people coming through it. They're getting a lot out of it. But particularly the labor leaders are going back to their plants with some of these ideas. And frankly, some of them are getting the stuffing
Yeah.
kicked out of them. And some of them, frankly, honestly, are losing union elections. They're being labeled as, management patsies and that kind of thing, because they're starting to talk about, forms of worker management participation and worker participation at the point of production, literally on the lines.
Yeah.
And so we think what we have to do is run a program like this for everyone who works for General Motors in North America. Do you want to do it? And like we said a couple of years before, we said, yeah, sure, no problem.
Oh my gosh.
So we took this 4-week program, and it was like producing an album. It was like the best of, we took what we thought were the most critical elements of this 4-week program, condensed it into 1 week, because we were about to launch this program eventually in probably at least half of General Motors manufacturing facilities in the United States.
How many
So
people?
we go from running a leadership program that put maybe 300 or 400 people a year through this educational process and this kind of discourse and dialogue and deep conversation process. And now we have this 1-week curriculum, and we're flying all over the United States delivering this 1-week program. I'm still in graduate school. I'm still trying to finish my PhD. And at that point in time, a few of us, some friends of mine from Detroit, a couple of the people from Boston, we decided to start our own consulting company. And we picked one of the absolutely weirdest, dumbest, stupidest names possible. I can remember one night sitting around with a dear friend of mine in the social economy program, who I won't, he will remain nameless. But he was one of my best friends. We're still very close. And somehow we came up with this idea of nomos, Nommos, the Greek term for community. It's like the center of the heart. So we've got this kind of grandiose idea, and in retrospect, Acme Consulting would have been better. But in any case, we start Nomos Consulting, and so now really I'm working full time, running this little consulting business, but doing a lot of the actual education and training work. So I'm flying all over the United States, as are several other friends and colleagues. And then in 1988 or 89, the UAW and Ford came to us. I did a lot of work with the UAW and Ford Motor Company. And then the UAW Chrysler National Training Center asked us to. So, now we go from 1988, 89. I finished my dissertation in the early 90s. And I'm flying all over the United States. And we're dealing with these very serious issues, plant closure. And we're trying to bring in a lot of the creative ideas that were embedded in social economy and workplace democracy. And those ideas evolved into something, for instance, that we called the Enterprise Compact. And we said that basically workers should, for all intents and purposes, have control over the production process and would take responsibility for the quality of the product that was being produced. And management's job was to ensure that the company was financially healthy and that people would still, have a good wage, and that there'd be works councils on the shop floor of these auto factories, and union representation up to and including on the boards of directors. So that's what we were promulgating. At the same time, we're all learning about why it is that Toyotas were, to be perfectly honest with you, better motor vehicles. right? And I won't go into the whole story of the 70s, but um, we learned a ton about the Toyota production system and lean manufacturing. And the question became, would there be a version of lean production that blended with the idea of workplace democracy and employee participation? And we said, absolutely, there's no question. Now, Toyota did everything possible to keep the UAW out. Toyota didn't believe you could run their lean manufacturing system in a unionized environment. But we worked with a number of plants, including this fabulous plant in Cleveland, Ohio, an engine plant, the Ford Cleveland engine plant. The day I showed up there, it was 1991, 92, something like that. I had been invited to come in and talk with the local union leadership and management. They were trying the plant didn't have a product. At one time, they had employed 8,000 people. They were down to 300. And the idea was to get the management and the union, the local union, thinking about. So anyway, long story short, out of that comes a modern operating agreement where the union really would take primary responsibility for running the plant, and there was a whole agreement about that, and they would develop what they called the Ford or the Cleveland production system, which was essentially the first real effort to build out in a social technology perspective the first version of a unionized, Americanized version of the Toyota production system. And because they did that, Ford gave the plant a new product, a brand new engine, their Duratec engine that was going to go into some of their most popular products, the Taurus, the Sable, and they got awarded that engine product. This is in the early 1990s, $1.2 billion for investment in new technology. They rebuilt this old plant and put together a committee that was called the Committee of 99, 66 workers and 33 engineers and salary people. And the Committee of 99 essentially was put in charge of the entire reconstruction of the plant, up to and including ordering and designing and ordering all of the equipment. So the local UAW local there had 66 members of the Committee of 99. So the union was putting its handprint all over, and a brand new labor agreement that where essentially the teams of workers would run the plant. So it was kind of an American version of the Toyota production system, and it was fabulous. 2 years after the plant opened, the plant won the Shingo Award from the Japanese government for the highest quality product in the world. So within 3 years of a plant being closed, it reopens, and we're running our week-long program in there almost every week because they're bringing people back into the plant. About 3,000 people came back in to work in the new plant, building the new engine. And we're running a 1-week training program for people, again, talking about what this new system and why and how they would have some voice and some say. And so now, now we're working with Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, and then along came the steel industry. I met 2 people at a conference that I attended. This one fellow, Mike, was the local steelworkers president at Inland Steel Company in East Chicago, Indiana. And his counterpart, was a fellow named Bill Baylor, who was the vice president of labor relations for Inland Steel. They were starting to talk about how they wanted to try to form some kind of partnership for Inland Steel and the United Steelworkers, again, to address some of the questions of competitiveness, but doing it together as opposed to just management trying to institute new practices or bring in new technology or perhaps eventually just close the place down. So I can remember they asked me, they said, could you do something for us like you're doing for the auto industry? And I said, sure. So this is 1995, 96. And so I went out to Inland Steel, right on the shore of Lake Michigan there, just outside of Chicago. And I spent about 2 or 3 months there because I didn't know a damn thing about how to make steel. So, I'm like, okay, we need to learn about this. I don't know how you make steel. And along the way, I'm talking with workers particularly and asking questions because we've been asked to put the entire workforce, about 7,000 people, through one of our kind of quote unquote education and training programs. So I interviewed a whole bunch of people who worked inland steel companies 24 hours a day. You never shut down a steel mill. They run continuously. And I remember being in the blast furnace one night late, and I'm talking with this one fellow, and he's telling me how he's worked there for more than 30 years. And we're having a conversation, and I'm like, what would you like? What would you want to know? Like, what would be helpful? I'm trying to hear from people what their ideas would be for what this program should be about. And this fellow looked me in the eye and said, well, I'll tell you, I've worked at this company for 30 years, and I still don't know how we make our steel. And I kind of was taken aback a little bit. And I'm like, please, sir, say that? What? And he said, well, I don't really understand the steelmaking process here. I do my job, but I would love to know how we make steel. And of course, I'm thinking to myself, this is nuts. So that one, and so one of the things we did in a program that we later called Heart of Steel, meaning the steel workers, was we went through the whole process of how steel is made and how Inland made its steel. And then we would, get people talking about, well, half the time that doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Well, why not? So this went on for about 2.5, 3 years. And some of the other steel companies out in the Midwest came and asked us to do the same thing. There was one out in Sterling, Illinois, out in Western Illinois. I loved it. Northwestern Steel and Wire. You'd fly into Chicago, and it was about another 3-hour drive out to Sterling, Illinois. So we were bringing these same ideas, right? So that's what I'm doing. And a very important piece that I should not have neglected, 1989, my first wife, Jennifer, and I, we have our second son, Robert. So I'm at that point in time, now I'm a road warrior because there aren't too many weeks when I'm not traveling because we're doing training for Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, lots of steel companies, different unions. And, it's the message is globalization and global competition is, I could see the damage that was being done in communities. There was no doubt about it. I heard it from people every time I walked into a union hall or a training conference room in one of the plants where we would always do our program. And it was very clear what the pain in America was. I remember being in the UAW Union Hall in Youngstown, Ohio, the day Bill Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we're talking about it, and I'm saying this is the dumbest thing imaginable. People are furious. These are union UAW members. Youngstown, Ohio has been devastated at that point. The steel industry was in crisis. And there was a General Motors plant in Lordstown, the infamous Lordstown plant, Lordstown, Ohio. And those jobs were, if those jobs left, as they eventually would, the devastation to these regional economies was, and also the individuals. And I wrote my PhD dissertation about a lot of the people and families and communities that were devastated by plant closures and that type of thing. So, on a pretty much on a day-to-day basis, we're working with people, and what we're basically trying to say is the old system, the old institutionalized system of labor relations in the United States had to change. Of course, Wall Street's alternative was just break up all these companies and send this work overseas, or invest in non-union plants in the South, which was happening all over the place. Toyota built a huge plant in Georgetown, Kentucky. Used to be cotton farms. Nissan built a huge plant in Smyrna, Tennessee. BMW, Spartanburg, South Carolina. I could go on and on and on. A lot of the international motor companies were building their manufacturing facilities in the South, in the right to work states. And they were telling the workforce, the reason that Ford and General Motors are going under is because of the UAW. And the UAW tried desperately to organize. They had 3 organizing drives at Smyrna, Tennessee, at the Nissan plant. They lost all 3 of them. So there was something seismic happening in the old 20th century industrial base in the United States. And basically, we were frankly being paid to go into these plants and talk with the union leadership, management, and the workers about, is there another way that we could do this where the union actually could potentially have, frankly, more power, where workers for the first time would have control over the production system, and where steel workers wouldn't have to say that I've worked here for 30 years, but I still don't understand how we make our steel products, right? Like, that's the problem here. And so that's what I did. I spent an awful lot of time crisscrossing what is the part of the United States now that so many people are asking questions about. Why did Donald Trump win Ohio? Why did he win Michigan in 2000? And I'm like, I don't want to oversell this or overstate, but I spent the better part of, 20 plus years in these communities, and I saw the devastation, but I also saw some of the successes. The Ford Cleveland engine plant was open and is still open to this day, and it's still producing one of the best engines that the Ford Motor Company produces anywhere in the world. There are auto plants in the United States that are still employing thousands of people that might not have been there, but for the fact that the union leadership and management, they were determined to try to keep the plant open. They knew how important these jobs were to the people in the community. They believed in their union, and they were willing to adapt and rethink what workplace democracy was about. And workplace democracy was not necessarily just about kicking management in the ass every chance you got, but it was really about having a lot more control over the production system so that your vehicles, the products that rolled off those assembly lines, were more likely to be products that people would be, more than happy to drive. So that's my social economy story.
Well, that's your life story, isn't it?
It is very much. I mean, this was not a job. And it wasn't even just a business. I met I mean, so much of this was about deep structural change, deep system change, but there wasn't a day that goes by that you don't meet people who are just absolutely I'm still very good friends and very close with particularly some of the UAW people that I met around the country. Many of them now aren't with us anymore, or they've retired, but we try to stay in touch. And I just, um, and in many ways, I have a very different perspective than some people do who believe that, frankly, the angry white American working class, you know, these people are much, much, much more complex, like all other human beings. And these are people, a lot of people who, care desperately about their communities, about their families, about the country. Um, and, I just met and worked with so many wonderful people who, what they had in common was they were a member of a labor union. And I still think you can't have economic justice without strong unions.
Yeah.
It's a prerequisite, and I think you can't explain inequality in America solely on the basis of deunionization. But it is worth noting that in the mid and late 1960s, the city that had the highest per capita income in the United States was not New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, it was Detroit.
Detroit. I was going to say that. Yeah, isn't that
Okay.
amazing? Right.
Per capita household income.
Yeah.
Because those people, when you had a contract, a 3-year contract, and in it was something called the annual improvement factor. Every year, you got a 3% increase in your wages, plus all your benefits. Well, over a period of several years, or 2 or 3 or 4 contracts, you might have been making $12.50 an hour, but 8 years later, 9 years later, you're making $20 an hour.
Yeah.
So your wages are keeping up. Not only are they keeping up with the cost of living, but you're actually doing a little bit better. So the auto worker, who went to work at a GM plant after the war, in the 1960s and 70s, they have a nice home in Dearborn or, any of the communities around Detroit. They might even have a little hunting lodge up in the UP with some friends, or a little cottage on the Lake Erie out in, Lexington or a place like that. And frankly, some of their sons and some of their daughters went off to Michigan State or Ohio State, right? They were able to, go to college. Um, and, the UAW, I mean, I saw it in a lot of the plants. The racial conflicts were quite evident. But on the other hand, people like Walter Reuther and Irving Bluestone and the leadership of the UAW, they were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. And, I walked into a lot of plants where, Black workers, Chicano workers, white workers, I mean, we're union brothers and sisters, and we support each other. And that was not an absolute social reality, obviously, but I think unions like the UAW, um, you know, did a lot to try to bring, certainly income equality. I mean, right? The contract covered everybody,
Right. You,
and
you created a thriving
and
middle class, right?
yeah,
Prosperity. I mean,
yeah.
that's what it was. It made so much sense.
So anyway, but yeah, it started with a paper that a group of grad students wrote in 1982, talking about how new technology impacted industrial relations in the telecommunications industry. And, a FIPSI grant that got some of us out to places like the GM plant in Framingham, Massachusetts. And so there is a kind of, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
there's a kind of almost quantum phenomenon going on here. I can assure you, when I was first going into graduate school, the last thing in the world I ever imagined myself doing was, spending, weeks and months in places, all across the industrial Midwest, from, Kenosha, Wisconsin to Tonawanda in New York, working directly in factories with hourly workers and salary people, talking about a new kind of social contract that was based on a notion of industrial democracy and workplace democracy that would prove to be kind of the new kind of intellectual center of labor relations in the United States, um, toward the goal of, producing good products, um, that were competitive in a global marketplace.
Russ, this has been fascinating, just amazing, to think where you started, in Arlington with your mom and dad and your family and everything you've done. I mean, you've had a major impact on so many people and families, and incredible, Russ, just incredible. You
Yeah.
should be proud.
Well, I mean, I know it's going to sound like a cliche, but I mean, it was just such a blessing. I mean, to have these opportunities, um, you know, starting with the people at the social economy program, Sev Bruin, who, was, without getting waxing too poetic, I think that Sev had a kind of spirit that, there was a kind of quality of humanness, humanity,
Yeah, absolutely.
um, and people who intellectually were prepared to, take some risks,
Yeah,
and we all supported each other. It was just a fabulous cohort of people at that time, the 1980s at BC,
yeah,
and that, and then to be able to go out into the world and try to say, okay, how do these ideas have any meaning
yeah,
to steel workers or auto workers
yeah,
or teachers or, whatever, and and then to try to think about how to do that in a way, that it makes a difference.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And it was, I met some wonderful people, and, I'm blessed, and, um, yeah. So, you know, go social economy. And look, and these that we're talking now almost 40 years ago, 30
Right,
years ago, but
right.
I mean, we all know that, maybe the best days for workplace democracy and social democracy is ahead of us,
Right, that's right.
because we've seen what happens in a world where, um, you know blatant competition and, racism and classism get to play out, on such a grand scale.
Right.
Um, I mean, the sad thing is that particularly, working people in America are far worse off than they were 40 years ago when
Yeah,
we started talking about these ideas.
yeah,
So, I mean, for me personally, most of this is past tense. I'm doing things now, working with, some technical high schools in Boston, and some other things that I'm doing. But, these ideas still have great currency, and I hope some of them will work their way into the policies of the new administration.
there you go. There's always hope.
Indeed.
Thanks again, Russ. This has been wonderful. And thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate, giving me the opportunity to reflect a bit on things that I've been, honored and privileged to be involved with, like the social economy program at BC.